Welcome to the show, guys. Today I have an amazing guest. I'm talking about the former ambassador from South Africa to the United States, Ibrahim Rasool. This guy is a real profile in courage and wisdom. Is a friend of Nelson Mandela, worked close with him, even served time in prison with him. And we're going to talk about his life, the things that he's learned. Let him get the record straight on being, declared persona non grata by Marco Rubio, ending his ambassadorship from South Africa to the United States, and get into a lot of the trends that he's seeing globally when it comes to social justice. And we're going to get some benefit from his wisdom and experience. So, without further ado, I want to go ahead and welcome Ambassador Rasool to the show. Ambassador Rasool, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It is so nice to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you very much. I am very privileged to be on the Isa Galloway show. Alhamdulillah.
Ambassador Rasool, I wanted to start off this interview giving you the chance to address how you became the former ambassador from South Africa to the United States, the whole persona non grata status, given to you by Marco Rubio. He came out with all kinds of reasons and accusations, but my gut feeling is it was because South Africa had the moral courage to take the case against the nation of Israel on committing genocide against the Palestinians. What say you?
Thank you very much. I think that it's indeed true that the cardinal reason that South Africa, from the outset of Donald Trump's second term of presidency, the central reason is South Africa's moral courage on the issue of the genocide in Palestine. I think that we went beyond outrage, we went beyond solidarity, we went beyond the platitudes that this is terrible, and we thought that someone needs to take action. We waited for the neighbors, we waited for the OIC, we waited for the Muslim world, we waited for the civilized world, if I can call it that, to stand up, but no one did. And so it was a country with enormous costs to itself that had to take the step of charging Israel with genocide in the International Court of Justice. And we followed that up with thousands of pages and footage and all of those kind of things that constitute the evidence for our case. And that is what we have done, and we are putting our case before the judges in the ICJ. And so that is what I think has infuriated the USA tremendously. Initially, it infuriated even the whole Western world that South Africa did this.
Right.
But I think that when South Africa showed both moral courage to do what it did and then moral clarity, because we did not go on an emotional binge to the ICJ. We went with an evidence-based, intellectual, as well as a legal case. We brought some of our best legal minds to bear on this case, and that fired the imagination of ordinary citizens. It pushed back the guilt-ridden sympathy that Israel would ordinarily have. And it wasn't because South Africa was anti-Israel, because we've always believed in the two-state solution. It wasn't because South Africa was anti-Jewish, because we had Jews in the heart of the anti-apartheid struggle playing prominent roles.
That's right.
But we knew where the institutionalized Orthodox Jewish institutions are and where the heartbeat of Judaism as a noble religion finds itself. And so they couldn't dismiss us as anti-Semitic, as anti-Jewish, because we make a distinction between a faith and an ideology, a manifestation of belief and the things that are done to defend a country like Israel. And so that was the key thing. But it is that even was born out of the fact that South Africa was one of the last countries to be liberated from white supremacist colonialism, because we stared white supremacism in the face with its nuclear weapon, with its superior army, with its support from the West. It was up to ordinary people like ourselves, led by great leaders like Nelson Mandela, to confront that. And therefore, within the recent confrontation with South African white supremacy, we can see all the fingerprints of that supremacism in the US administration, particularly under Donald Trump. We could see, for example, that one of the driving fears is that there was a white vote that was shrinking, and that tribalism was the way to wake up that white vote, to ring the bell of danger, and to mobilize them against a perceived enemy who was everyone but white. And so, and the exploitation of Democrats' weaknesses, their, their compulsion with wokeism, I think, was one of the great weaknesses, and their moral connivance with Israel was another weapon that confused people who should have been voting Democratic rather than Republican. And so it was in confronting that notion of supremacism that Donald Trump invented the idea that there was a white genocide in South Africa and created the fiction that there were refugees, white refugees in South Africa who needed rescuing, and he flew over 49 of them to the USA to come and stay there, when they are the the most privileged people. Imagine 7% of your population owning 72% of your land. Imagine 7% of your population owning 95% of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and you call that oppression, you call that a genocide, you call that a land confiscation, and that is the uncomfortable thing that a South African ambassador has had to call out. And therefore, it became absolutely crucial for that ambassador not to cause contagion amongst other ambassadors, the Canadians who are facing tariffs, the Mexicans who are facing tariffs, the Brazilians who are facing tariffs, the Europeans who are facing tariffs, that the contagion had to be stopped with the South African ambassador, and therefore declare him persona non grata. Otherwise, Washington could have been much wilder in the face of this demon that is visiting suffering across the world, with the ending of health funds, funds to fight HIV and tuberculosis, funds to fund the research for vaccines against HIV and other things. I mean, the world was made for protest, but an example had to be made of the South African ambassador.
So you have, you know, as your position, you travel a lot, you got to know the United States very well. One of the things that I think is so fascinating is the Muslim vote in the West in general, and specifically the Muslim vote in the United States. You know, building up to the election, we had a lot of people, trying to call or pull the Muslim community in one way or another. Everything from people supporting Donald Trump, which kind of blew my mind, to um, wanting to punish the Biden-Harris administration by boycotting initially Biden, and then, being never Harris, trying to push her to be different in foreign policy, especially on the genocide, than her predecessor. And one of the things I don't understand is how, um, and I deal with the Muslim community here all the time in the United States, and I think this represents a more global issue, is Muslims in the West trying to choose how to best use their vote, or even if they should use their vote. In some cases, people are debating that. So, what I'm trying to ask you really is, now that we have hindsight and we're seeing what's happening, how do you help the community kind of grapple with all the fractioning that it had of its vote? And then, what do you think the role is of the American Muslim community, or Muslims more broadly in the West, when it comes to being good allies of other communities when we use our vote?
I think that there is a central problem in the global Muslim community and particularly its minority manifestation. As we speak now, 25% of Muslims live as a minority. Almost all of them are facing some pressure or the other. Even the big minorities in India, the big minorities in China, and the big minority in Myanmar. They have recently come into the spotlight. And so Islamophobia is no longer a kind of Western phenomenon. It is now a global phenomenon, with South Africa having probably the freest space for its Muslim minority anywhere in the world. And so and so the Muslim minority community ought to be grappling with how they exercise their options as citizens. The primary option being the vote. So in 2024, there were 64 consequential elections across the globe. And there was not a single way in which there was coherence within countries and between countries about how to manage those votes. For one, there was a lack of understanding the interconnection between all of this at the particular moment, because 2024 was the decisive moment in which populism transformed itself from a loose amalgam into a mainstreamed extremism.
Interesting.
It was basically the reoccupation of the White House. It was basically the 30% that Marine Le Pen could muster, the 10% across the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands, the government of Hungary, of Italy, um, and and so forth, and even in South Africa. The Muslim community is very coherent and outspoken and outraged about the situation in Israel, but by and large helped, for whatever domestic reasons, helped to decimate the ANC, who took Israel to the International Court of Justice, to decimate it from 57% to 40%, forcing it into coalition with the Democratic Alliance, for whom most Muslims voted in South Africa. And the Democratic Alliance is the arch party that supports Israel. And so even here, that incoherence was tremendous, and the consequences are not theoretical. The consequences are that Israel today enjoys an impunity because A, it has global alliances, particularly to the United States. B, it has unlimited weaponry to do what it must do. And C, it has a kind of hold over the Middle East because it is the designated gendarme of the region, the patrol boat that looks after the region, the policeman of the Middle East. And so it has the impunity to go into Lebanon, to go as far as Yemen, to go straight to Iran, and let alone Gaza and the West Bank. And so Israel today has within its sights its end game, which is an Israeli state from the river to the sea, with Palestinian holes in between, patrolled by both the army and the settler communities of Israel. And so those are the consequences of the election. And what it says to me, Isa, is that there is a fundamental contemporary absence of the fiqh mu'amalat, the jurisprudence of statecraft, of politics, of economics, of the socio-economic and cultural domains. We are very adept at the fiqh ibadat, the jurisprudence of worship. And so we retreat into all of those kind of things. We make pious statements from those kind of um, ramparts about whether voting is allowed or not, who to vote for and who not to vote for. To say, let's choose this party, um, even if it will give Israel its end game, rather than that party because morally that party has LGBT in it, etc., etc. And so the fit of worship kind of dominates the strategic, tactical, and principled realities of what may be needed. And so I think that Muslims, if we are going to stop Israel from achieving its end game, Muslims are going to be critical, but thankfully not pivotal. Because what we have seen is that Muslims have been animated about Palestine, but we come across as the usual suspects. People don't know from which angle we're coming from. Is it a historic hatred of Jews? Is it the fact that that we can't distinguish between a Zionist and a Jew, and our language is indistinguishable? Is it that we have this kind of grudge that is there? Are we the usual suspects in that? Um, and so forth. Fortunately, there are new entrants onto the terrain because that is what South Africa has been able to do. It has been able to go and mobilize the campus against the capital in the USA. It has been critical to arouse civil society to their better angels in Europe and to put pressure on their governments. It has made the Arab streets restless and the palace nervous in the Middle East. And so what we are seeing, even that South Africa's case, with its evidence, has generated even young Jews who no longer have the grandmother to refresh their memory about Auschwitz. And so they are able to look at the matter on its merit and not with the historical fear that Jews used to be able to have. And so now that they look on its merit, they say, not in my name. This is not why our grandparents died at Auschwitz. We cannot have a repeat of Auschwitz done to the Palestinians. And so that, I think, is where our hope comes from for the impunity to stop.
You know, one of the things that I'm really concerned about is if you pay attention to polling on, the MAGA movement and Trump's support, um, I've seen everything from about 25 to 30% of the population. And at best case scenario, that means like 1 in 4 people that I run into are part of MAGA. Now, I don't think it's as black and white as a lot of folks kind of make it out. I mean, um, the original Trump voters, a big chunk of them were former Obama voters from the Rust Belt, that just kind of thought, why not gamble with this guy? Because, he's not traditionally part of either party. And we've been bouncing back and forth and not getting our interests met. But on the other hand, like I'm not out here trying to get bigots to love me or anything like that. Like instead, I want to be able to, not have the contagion spread where, um, yeah, at the end of the day, if 1 in 4 people is so um, bought into this movement of essentially being white adjacent or white supremacist, I'm trying to figure out like how to deal with these folks and um, perhaps how to talk to the Muslim community to kind of navigate the um, the environment we're in, because I feel like um, there's tolerance and then there's also like containment, and I kind of look at the MAGA movement almost like we need a Cold War era kind of policy of containment to keep from giving fuel to the fire that is MAGA. Do you have thoughts about this kind of political reality of the 1 in 4 people being part of the MAGA movement, and how so many people, especially from the Muslim community or other disenfranchised or minority communities, got sucked into the situation where they considered voting for Trump, and what to do about it moving forward?
I think that the issue is that there is a small core that would be your rabid racists, bigots, and so forth. But it is the ability of that core to aggregate around it. And so one of the key things that the Democrats did in the US was to overreach, both on their support for Israel, because then they alienated and confused an entire Muslim community that, despite American foreign policy, despite American support for coups in the Arab Spring and so forth, they were willing to give the Democrats the benefit of the doubt on the basis of the lesser of two evils. Um, but when the Democrats overreach on support for Israel and overreached, for example, on wokeism, on, for example, making not your toleration of LGBTQI plus, but your embrace of it as a precondition for citizenship, your acceptance of certain things that Muslims are still grappling with, like termination of pregnancy and all of those kind of things. They effectively donated, not just Muslims, Arab Muslims, for example, to Trump. They also donated African American men to Trump who have similar problems, and they donated Catholic Hispanics to Trump, and they donated Middle America to Trump. And so the core 25% that you speak about was aggregated by a lot of discontent, but not conviction. And so the ability for conviction to attract discontent is what went wrong. I think there, and I think across the liberal Western world, because they all have the same kind of um, approach to politics, and it is their way of trying to discern who deserves to be European, who deserves to be American, and let us make the LGBT and abortion and this and that the litmus test for your ability and your um, deservedness to be citizens in the West. And in that, I think they lit a fuse that the world is trying to recover from at this moment.
There's a phenomenon that I really want us to explore, and I think that what happens a lot of times with Muslims in America, probably in the UK as well. And again, I'm not familiar with around the globe as you are, but it's about tolerance, and also how I think the Muslim community, especially in America, gets duped on conservative values coming from white Christian nationalists who I think want to use our community to advance their own cause, and then eventually are going to, whatever benefits for working with them they dangled out are going to, uh, retract those from us. And a prime example for me here would be like vouchers, which is the way to take your tax dollars that would normally fund public schools to be used in private and parochial schools. And on the surface, as a Muslim community, that sounds great because you want your kids to go to an Islamic school, have that more moral environment, have Arabic and Quran, as part of the curriculum. However, the thing there is, though, these people that are advancing vouchers are generally Christian nationalists, and they're happy to use us to get the policies across the finish line and passed into law. But I can just 100% of the contempt that they have for Islam and Muslims will eventually find ways to exclude us, like calling Islamic schools, terrorist outfits or organizations. And you wrote this wonderful book called Living Where We Don't Make the Rules. And that's why I was thinking this idea of tolerance. I always say you tolerate a rash, but you never respect it. And you have a really great interest to chapter 4 on this, which is we still carry the paradigm of tolerance with us. As long as you tolerate, you can never really agree. As long as you simply tolerate, you can only endure, you never engage. Therefore, the transition from a paradigm of tolerance to a paradigm of citizenship, of coexistence, of acceptance, of embrace, of engaging is an important transition for us to be made towards treating our societies and our contexts as Dardas Shahada. So you wrote that into the introduction of that chapter, which is called Dardas Shahada. For me, I would call it, a Dawa-centric approach um, towards being a minority in the United States. But I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about this idea of how to balance, um, you know, where we're at and not being duped to harm other communities while we're, trying to advocate for the rights and the things that we believe in.
Yeah, no, but I think that there are two ways that the Muslim other is thought of in the Western world. The initial way is how can we get them onto our side to establish us as the ruling party. And so the appeal to socially conservative values and the moral questions, not the moral with the M, justice, not the moral with the M, equity and equality and righteousness and so forth, but the small m, sexual behavior, um, this thing, that thing. Uh, and so that has, for example, wrote in Bush um, number 2, because he was very big on that. Muslims, particularly in Florida, gave him the decisive vote, and we had the war on terror after that. So the small m model won him the election, and then he violated the big M, peace and justice, um, and so forth in the world. Trump, the same thing. Those ulama who endorsed him in the Midwest, they went for the small m, and today I'm hoping they're regretting that the big model has been sacrificed. So we need to understand those kind of things, and therefore this fiqh of mu'amalat, this jurisprudence of the world, of world engagement, of the socio-political and economic and cultural, is what needs to be thought through very urgently and very thoroughly in the West. 25% of the ummah find themselves in a situation of being in a minority, whether they are the big minorities of the East, India, China, Myanmar, or the smaller minorities in the West, Europe, North America, etc. We need to work through this, and this is where this book that you have highlighted, Living Where We Don't Make the Rules, begin to come in. Because on the one hand, it does not speak about not making the rules as a permanent condition. It says we want to be in a position where one day we will be part of making the rules, as is the case with the South African Muslim community. We are in a position to help make the rules because we paid with our blood, sweat, and tears in the anti-apartheid struggle. We went to jail with our black community. We were killed on the streets and massacred with our black community. We were assassinated with our black community. And so, for example, um, one of the problems, I think, is that your Arab Indian Muslims of the last 60 years in the USA have not made their peace and reconciliation with the African American Muslim community. And therefore, had they done that, Islam today would be the second oldest monotheism in the USA. But because we have dichotomized between the enslaved of 400 years ago and the immigrants of 60 years ago, I think we have dissipated ourselves. And so those same racial cleavages translate into political cleavages. High and large African American Muslims vote Democratic because they have this heritage of who ended enslavement. Whereas, and they are your kind of working class, impoverished communities today who put their hope on the food stamps of the Democrats, on the Social Security, on the Medicaid, on the civil liberties. On the one hand, whereas our richer Indo-Arab Muslims are choosing where the debentures are best, where the vouchers are best, where our private schools are best, where our road situations are best, where the small immoral issues are best catered for. And so it is that incoherence that I speak about that finds itself across the 64 elections of that consequential year, 2024. And so what we need to understand as a community who are living where we don't make the rules is that we have to find that middle path between succumbing to our circumstances and say, we have no power here. Let's not worry. Let's just go with the flow. And Muhammad will become Mo, and Samaun will become Sam. And we will assimilate into this situation. And that's what this book is about. On the other hand, as we see in places like Birmingham in the UK, the opposite of assimilation takes place. We are busy with isolation. We don't even need to learn to speak English. Our spice shop are there. Spice shops are there. Our khutbah is in Bangla. Um, we are self-sufficient and we are in blissful isolation. South Africa has found that that's our contribution, that there is a middle path of absolute engagement, and we call it integration. But the core of the word integration is integrity. We respect the integrity of the country and the nation to want to be prosperous, want to solve the problems, want to be a force for change. And in return, we ask the nation to be respectful of our integrity as Muslims who eat halal, who pray on a Friday and may want to take off work, who don't want exam schedule for our children while there is Eid taking place, who don't want we don't want to have the prostitutes and the bottle stores taken out of our way, but we want the freedom to say no, and we want the freedom to immunize our children against those kind of phenomena. And so, and we, in turn, in respect for the integrity of the nation, we promise that in opposing it, we will never fall into hate speech and incitement to violence. And so that's the kind of Daru Shahada that we are trying to build, a place for the free profession and confession of our faiths, because in return we get a Darus Salam, an abode of peace. We get a Darul Aman, an abode of security. We get a Darul Da'wah, an abode to proclaim the message. We get a Darul Aqd, an abode where we fulfill our obligations as citizens.
One thing I keep going back to in my mind as we talk is this idea that a minimum of the Trump supporters is 1 in 4 people, that we meet, 25%. And I keep thinking, like not just about containment, but I don't want to live necessarily with people who are going to be perpetually uh, weaponized against our community. We've had decades and decades of anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Arab sentiment, xenophobia, and weaponizing race versus whiteness, privilege versus working people, and all of these things happening. And I keep thinking back to Islam's version of an MLK quote, where MLK basically says, I'll say the quote here in a second, but the idea I took from it was that, um, and it's based on something a scholar told me actually. The idea I take from it is that, uh, you're never going to win the hearts and minds of people by just pure shaming or conflict. The quote that MLK said was, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. And hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Now, I'm not here saying, we should love bigots and, sing kumbaya with people who don't respect our basic humanity. But, I remember an Islamic scholar here in North America once told me, he said, you're not going to serve a people if you have contempt for them. And I just remember reflecting on that. And I wanted to pick your brain a little bit on your experience of, suffering under apartheid, being jailed for that work, and, the example of Nelson Mandela that you learned, and how to, win hearts of minds of your enemies, and thinking that, they're a product of indoctrination. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Now, look, I think that Nelson Mandela described very much our mission to humanize South Africa. And he said that we have a moral duty to give the humanity back also to the white community, because in the process of racial oppression, they have dehumanized themselves. So while we must be able to ensure that we humanize Black South Africans who have been dehumanized, we have the similar responsibility towards whites. And so that is the case, and it is very much in accordance with one of the prophetic traditions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who was asked, how do you prevent the oppressor? How do you give dignity back to? And the response was by preventing him from oppressing. And so it's very much an Islamic principle, if I can put it like that. And so that is the transition from the Meccan period, where Muslims and Islam was under attack. And we had martyrdom of Sumayyah, may Allah be pleased with her. The torture of Sayyidina Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him. The bankrupting of Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him. The humiliation of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and so forth. In the midst of all of that comes Surah Al-Kafirun, that describes the essential difference between the believers and the disbelievers, the opponents of Islam. And it ends with a call to tolerance. Lakum dinukum waliyadin. To you, your way, and to me, mine. And it is the rash. The Quraysh was going to be there like a rash, and we are going to tolerate them. And that is then taken to Taif, where the Prophet ﷺ is humiliated. They set the slaves and the children onto the Prophet ﷺ to stone him to such an extent that the blood kicks his sandals to his feet. And the angel comes and says, I have been asked to put these mountains at your disposal. What will you do with them? We can crush them. And the answer is, maybe out of this generation will come a future generation who will be good. So you can see the paradigm of tolerance with a strategic view to the future. Then when they are established as a city-state in Medina, Surah Mumtahina comes. لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم يخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليه إن الله يحب المقسطين. Allah does not forbid you from having relations with those non-Muslims who A, do not fight you for your faith, and B, do not drive you from your homes. And if they don't do that, Allah asks that you interact with them with justice and with kindness. Justice is a legal mechanism. Kindness is an emotional disposition. towards them. And so the paradigm of tolerance shifts to a paradigm of human embrace. And that is it. And the multiplicity of conditions reduces to two. Do they fight you for your faith? And do they drive you and exile you from your home? If they don't do that, you owe them justice and kindness. And so what does that mean for us in the world today? We are not Muslims in America by accident. We are not Muslims in Europe by accident. We are not Muslims in South Africa by accident. We are not Muslims in India by accident. Allah makes no such accidents. Ours, even there, I would even go so far as to say, especially there, we have to be rahmatul lil alameen, a mercy unto all creation. Because it is in that exuding of mercy that we surprise with generosity. When they are expecting a frothing at the mouth Muslim, because we have all reason to be angry, given the genocide, given Islamophobia, and all of. But as Nelson Mandela told us, let us surprise them with our generosity. And when we surprise them, in this case with our generosity and our compassion or mercy, that is what softens the ground for it to be Darul Da'wah. And so before you want it to be Darul Aman, we are insecure. Let's fight for security. Let us use our vulnerability to proceed with Darul Da'wah, the abode of proclaiming a message. And that, I think, is what we are on about. We must surprise them with our generosity rather than confirm every stereotype they have built up against us. And that is the art of the possible that the Ummah may have forfeited, that we may have lost. And so we play true to foe. We play the outraged. And so maybe, I don't know, but maybe a Mamdani, who, whether he carries the name or whether he carries the faith or whatever the case may be, but he is going to be seen as a Muslim. Maybe his quest for social justice may be the one that catches the American imagination. Maybe his quest for inclusion is going to light the American spirit again. And so let's not debate what kind of Muslim he is, where he is. He is burdened with a name that makes him Muslim in the eyes of the ultra-right. And so let us rather use the opportunity to take the positive stuff that he stands for in order to surprise American society that we stand for an inclusive justice that I think America needs and the world needs very much today.
One of the things I keep coming back to is how, looking at the genocide in Gaza and how time is never keeping up with the need, right? But how, you know, in October or November 2023, you had a narrative shift from, Israel has the right to defend itself, or they had to respond, all of this stuff, and history basically starting in October 2023 and not knowing the background and, all the issues that lead up to things. I mean, as a younger person, I traveled in Europe because I was an army brat in the mid 80s, early 90s. And I got to see, communist East Germany, Poland, Hungary. I actually visited Auschwitz and Dachau myself, stuck my head in the cremation ovens, walked through the gas chambers marked as showers. And, you know, that case, of course, is incredibly unique in that it was, an ideology of just pure hatred against the Jewish people. Um, but when you think of like how World War One led to World War Two, and um, you know the sanctions and the humiliation of the German people after World War One, it was setting it up for the radicalization that then could be used to sow hate and point at a minority population. And where I'm going with this is that, you worked directly with Nelson Mandela. You considered him a friend, and were in prison together. And, even Nelson Mandela's story arch kind of changes from, being considered a terrorist all the way to, the Nobel Peace Prize. And so I see how, with the Palestinian struggle and the larger narrative against Muslims across the world is always terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. And the foreign policy that, is having such a devastating impact on Muslim majority nations. Um, and then the whole narrative of like, they hate you for our freedoms kind of thing. They hate us for our freedoms kind of thing. It, these ridiculous kind of canards. Um, so like these evolutions from being considered a terrorist to a freedom fighter to even a Nobel Peace Prize. And now we have books of, one day um, everyone will have always been against this. So I wanted to ask in conclusion of our interview, what are three lessons from Nelson Mandela that you think are most relevant today that we should be thinking through and learning from?
Thank you very much. It's a complicated question, but let me end it on
Sorry.
those three lessons of a Nelson Mandela. I think that when Nelson Mandela was facing the death sentence in 1964 in a court of law, his lawyers advised him not to provoke the judge to actually do the death sentence on him. But he made the statement that basically said, in defiance of what his lawyers advised him, he basically said that we stand for a non-racial democratic South Africa in which all people, black and white, will be equal. And he said it is an ideal for which ideally we want to live for, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which we are prepared to die. And he challenged the judge. And then the judge was faced with a moral decision. Do I make a martyr of this man? But the important thing out of that is that Nelson Mandela's statement there was a statement of what he was prepared to live for, as well as what was worthy to die for. And I think that as Muslims, we need to ask ourselves, what is so precious in the world that we are prepared to die for it? Because once we've identified that, we know what to live for. Everything else pales by comparison. So I don't think that the ummah that is founded on niyyah, on intentionality and purpose, that this ummah has defined for itself individually and severally a sense of purpose in the world. What is so valuable that we will lay down our life for it? Because then you don't have to be the suicide bomber that actually lays down your life for it. You then know what you must live for. So that's the first thing that I think is absolutely crucial. The second thing is that spirit of generosity, of mercy. But it comes from the idea that when Nelson Mandela was released after 27 years, and they asked him, are you not angry and bitter with the people who imprisoned you? And Nelson Mandela said, if I leave this prison and I am bitter and angry with the people who imprisoned me, I will remain imprisoned for the rest of my life. that for me to be free, I must divest myself of my anger. And what that means is that any movement for change, for reform, for revolution, for liberation, if it is founded not on a future vision that is going to be a better place for the world, then it is a movement to avenge the past. If you are not a movement to make the world a better place, free of the hatreds, free of the enmity and the animus, and the inequalities and the injustice that you are mired in currently, and anger consumes you, then you are simply a movement to avenge the past. And so that's the crux of what Nelson Mandela stood for. And then the final thing that I want to say, and this was missed in the Arab Spring, Nelson Mandela understood that the first responsibility of a successful revolution is to prevent counter-revolution. You can do whatever you want to about your ideals, your angers, your absolute justice that you want. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't first fortify yourself to protect your gains, you don't have the platform from which to achieve your ideals. So, you had Arab Spring countries that wanted immediately to punish Mubarak. They wanted immediately to do this and to do that, but they lived for 30 months. The application of that to Muslims in the West is, if you have the vote, protect and use the vote. If you have democratic rights, protect and utilize those democratic rights. Because, as I often told Muslims in Washington, D.C., you may want to have your university here, you may want to have your mosques here, you may want to do, but your primary reason where Allah has placed you in Washington, D.C. is because Allah has placed you in the ear of the superpower. Allah has placed you as an irritant in the ear of the superpower. Find your voice, find your wisdom, find your amplifier, and make sure that what you say here has an impact on what happens in Israel, what happens in the Middle East, what happens in Africa, Asia, Latin America, because you've been placed in the ear of the superpower. Protect that game before you want to have many other ambitions for you and your family and your community. So those are the three kind of strategic lessons out of what I have learned from having spent a little bit of time with Nelson Mandela in prison, having traveled with him across the African continent, having served in his government, and having been a close friend of his throughout those are valuable lessons, and none of them are not rooted in what I believe in as a Muslim. That's what I think is important.
Jazakumullah khair, Ambassador Rasool. It has been such a pleasure learning from you today. I hope everybody truly enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and share this video so that it reaches more people. And until the next time, may God bless you all. Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum.
Isa Galloway.
Hi, Isa Galloway.
Isa Galloway, convert to Islam, defines the mission.
Kind of a show that will put people on the edge of their seat.
Because it leads to the future and a more sophisticated approach.